and that means it's time to kick off our conference today. We are going to have more and more people joining us as it gets later in the day, I'm sure, but this is a great crowd to begin with. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of the law school, and I'm also the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center. One of the wonderful things about having two deans is it allows me to continue to work in the field of international law, and Jessica Berg, the co-dean, to do work in health law. When you came in, there were these brochures of the Cox International Law Center. It's our annual newsletter, and this is actually our 25th anniversary. You probably saw a big thing out there when you were registering that said, announcing the 25th anniversary of the Cox Center. 25 years ago, we were endowed by the George Gunn Foundation. We have the largest endowment of any international law center in the country. And there is this timeline of the important milestones that I would call your attention to when you have a free moment to look through this. And it's really pretty spectacular what this law school has been able to do in the 25 years in the world of international law. Now, how many of you are people that have come regularly to our international conferences? So that's wonderful. You guys know how exciting these conferences are every year. How many of you are students? And so lots of students, some members of the Journal of International Law. So this is going to be a wonderful day. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Museum of Art, and art and international law is a very hot topic in the news these days. Everything from the continuing struggle of the ownership and return of the Elgin Marbles that are in the British Museum. Does anybody know the story of the Elgin Marbles? If you go to the British Museum, the entire Parthenon has been recreated with the original sides. And if you go down to the Parthenon, down in Greece, there's nothing but a skeleton. And Greece, of course, wants it back, and they've been struggling for at least 30 years in court, out of court, and international diplomacy. You've got the Machu Picchu relics, a big dispute that was between Yale Law School or Yale undergrad, where they are currently housed, and the government of Peru, where they were created. I was actually in Machu Picchu this summer with one of the panelists, Paul Williams. We were hiking around all the ruins, and we noticed that there's no museum or anywhere you can see the relics. Well, that's because they're all up at Yale. That has just been resolved, and Yale is going to be sending some of them back down. It's a long-term dispute that came to fruition. There are stories about that every day you read about art that is found in the attics of Europe that were confiscated from the Nazis. And so today we are going to learn about all the contemporary issues and struggles in the world of international law and art. At 11:45, I'm going to be back here with a one-on-one, it's actually two-on-one, with the director and president of our art museum across the street, and he's going to be telling you about the current issues that they're struggling with provenance at the art museum. So this particular conference is made possible by a generous grant from the Wolf Family Foundation. It's co-sponsored by the Frederick Cox International Law Center, the American Society of International Law, the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence, the Spangenberg Center for Law, Technology, and the Arts, and the Center for Professional Responsibility. And I want to tell you about some of the people who have made this possible. Tim Webster, who you'll be seeing, he's going to act as MC today, is the chair of the program committee, and he organized all of the panels, and in particular, panel 2 he put together. Dale Nance, who obtained our keynote speaker and our dinner speaker for the small group that will be joining us for dinner, and he organized panel 3. Professor Cassandra Robertson, who organized our essay contest and is chairing the Ethics Prize Award panel. This is a new thing where we said, listen, if you want to come and speak at our conference, write an amazing article about the ethics of law and art. And we picked the best ones out of hundreds of entries, and you'll get to see them. Some of them are students, some of them are professors. It's going to be exciting. Then we have Shannon French, the director of the Inamori Center, who organized panel number 1. And as I said, this program honors the 100th anniversary of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it's going to be a really exciting day. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dale Nance, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Margaret Myles, and we'll get things kicked off. And thank you again. I'll see you at 11:45. Have a great day.
Michael, and thanks very much for making it here this morning, despite being a little under the weather. Our keynote speaker this morning, Margaret Myles, is an archaeologist and art historian, currently the professor of art history and classics at the University of California, Irvine. She has had fellowships at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and the American Academy in Rome. She did excavation fieldwork in both Greece and Sicily, and she's the author of a wonderful book that I recommend to all of you. It's called Art as Plunder, The Ancient Origins of Debate About Cultural Property, published by Cambridge back in 2008. Did I just lose Mike? Hello? I think I lost it. It's good now. Okay. I read this book, ran across it when I was preparing my lectures for my course in the law of archaeological artifacts, and I consider it one of the most important books that I've read in terms of enriching my lectures to my students. So with no further ado, Margaret Myles.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here to see my old friend, Professor Jennifer Niles, who's in the classics department. And also, I'm very grateful to Dale for inviting me this morning. It's wonderful to have this topic more widely discussed and widely disseminated, and I'm really very pleased to be here. The summer of 2016 has seen significant new legislation passed or proposed that affects restitution and reparation and sets new limits on the antiquities market. On July 8th, the Bundesrat in Germany ratified new wide-ranging legislation on the sale of art that, among other provisions, limits the sale of antiquities by requiring export licenses from the country of origin and a 20-year history of provenance. In the United States, on June 7th, the Senate Judiciary Committee considered bipartisan legislation that would set a federal statute of limitation on restitution claims over Nazi-looted works of art. The impact of these new German and American laws, passed and proposed, is under debate, but both are remarkable for extending controls on ownership of art well beyond existing legislation in each country, resulting in a greater ethical awareness. For this timely conference on international art law, I would like to recall how and where ideas about repatriation, restitution, and proper ownership of art got started, a subject I have explored in detail elsewhere. The ideas about ownership of art rooted in classical antiquity are still potent and applicable today and deserve continuing discussion. Illicit acquisition and destruction of antiquities by war or commerce is an ongoing global problem. Ethical concerns about taking what belongs to someone else begins with what happened to humans in warfare. In the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the ancient Near East, typically human captives were either killed, sold into slavery, or ransomed. Ancient accounts single out for special comment instances when a conqueror exhibited magnanimity, that is, a noble generosity and loftiness of spirit when dealing with captive opponents. Cyrus the Great of Persia, active in the mid-6th century BCE, is remembered in the Hebrew Bible for allowing the return of captive Jews brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II back to Jerusalem, and even sent along 5,400 gold and silver vessels from the original temple. 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great is remembered for his humane treatment of the family of the defeated Darius III of Persia, particularly Darius' mother, Sisygambis. Darius had fled the battlefield at Issus, abandoning his family there, but Alexander addressed Sysigambis as mother and treated her well. The personal magnanimity of a conqueror was best illustrated by his humane treatment of captives, not only because of the implicit renunciation of revenge, but also because the human captives were the most valuable part of the booty, both materially, if they were to be sold or ransomed, and psychologically, if defeated opponents were to be exhibited to the public. Examples in antiquity of magnanimity toward a defeated enemy are rare. Augustus had hoped to show to the people of Rome the defeated Cleopatra in his triumphal procession after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, but she forestalled this by committing suicide, and he had to be content with exhibiting her waxen image instead. Taking the defeated people's property, as well as the people themselves, was the norm in antiquity, and the norm until quite recently. In an essay on the education of Cyrus the Great, Xenophon has him exhort his men before battle with the assertion that the law among all people is eternal, that when a city is captured by enemies, both the bodies of those in the city and their goods belong to those who capture it. Therefore, it is not by injustice that you will acquire whatever you may get, but it will be out of humanity, and the Greek for that is philanthropia, that you do not take something away if you allow them to keep anything. Ancient authors discuss the stupendous amount of gold, silver, and artistic items Alexander's army eventually captured at Persepolis, stored up there since the time of Cyrus. Alexander is said to have repatriated to Athens cherished iconic statuary that Xerxes' army had plundered during the Persian invasion of Greece in 480-479 BCE. The statues were a pair, probably marble, representing the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogeiton, the men who killed the Pisistraton tyrant Hipparchus, thus making way for the establishment of Athenian democracy. They were so cherished by Athenians that they had a substitute pair made soon after the first pair was plundered. And here you see Roman versions of the substitute pair that became famous throughout antiquity because it represented they represent Athenian democracy. With the beginning of ancient discussion about what we call cultural property, or art as a sort of shorthand, comes the ancient assumption that much, if not all, of what was highly valued in antiquity and looted in wars was originally created, dedicated, or used within a religious context. This is generally true of cultural artistic production until the early modern period, although art, even in a religious context, of course could convey also political values, including symbolic value as a trophy. The humane idea that something religious should be kept and used by those for whom it is a significantly religious item is ultimately based on ancient Greek understanding about what constitutes art. What is valued today in museums and on the antiquities market includes a much broader category, artifacts, such as pottery, coins, weapons, really any relic of everyday life, usually intended to be portable unless it was offered or deposited in a sanctuary or a tomb. After Alexander's death, his competing successors laid claim to what became an array of kingdoms, small relative to his enormous empire. Alexander and his Macedonian father before him had already pioneered the use of art, including religious dedications, to proclaim achievements and to demonstrate social superiority in palaces. The classical Greek social norm that surplus income, both personal and communal, should go to the gods in the form of public temples and dedications had shifted to a greater emphasis on private consumption and display. This new social pattern was modeled by the competing would-be princes and kings, now elevated from generalship into rulers, who saw the potential of art and architecture to communicate their ambitions. This is how collecting, in the modern sense, began in the Western world, with Hellenistic royalty competing with one another to buy up antiques and books and to commission the best artists and architects for ever more impressive new art. It was an age of tremendous production of art and architecture, fueled by the vast sums of gold and silver released into circulation through war and new mining operations in Thrace. Besides the shift to private uses of art, the Hellenistic monarchs also encouraged and sponsored scholarship and research on everything including art, which now became a topic for historical discussion and inspired literary production and also new ideas about connoisseurship, which feeds into the whole idea of collecting. Two turning points for the fate of art in war took place in 146 BCE. The Romans sacked and thoroughly destroyed Corinth and also Carthage, both of them ancient and wealthy cities on either end of the Mediterranean. Lucius Mummius, sacker of Corinth, kept nothing for himself, but rededicated statuary and other plunder in cities in Greece that had supported Roman policy and in towns in Italy where he wanted to make a splash with friends and relatives. Some 17 inscriptions have been found so far that commemorate his recycled dedications. Even more interesting is how Scipio Aemilianus handled the politically fraught issue of war booty after the destruction of Carthage. He too kept nothing for himself and forbade his household even to purchase any booty. He gave away Punic libraries to local chieftains, and he is said to have released the captured young nephew of an opponent and sent him home. Among the massive booty were many works of art that Carthaginians had plundered from cities and sanctuaries in Greek Sicily. Scipio arranged for these to be returned to their original locations and set up inscriptions commemorating their rededication, of which there are 3 preserved. This is the first historical example we have of repatriation of art on a large scale. Such wartime repatriation did not occur again until Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, commanded it after Waterloo. Scipio Aemilianus's actions in war, his weeping at the fall of Carthage and his daring to imagine the future fall of Rome, as well as an analysis of Roman behavior surrounding war booty, were all recorded by his contemporary and friend, the historian Polybius. As a Greek held hostage by Rome, Polybius had an outsider's view of Romans, but a view tempered by some admiration for what he saw accomplished by Roman rule. He disapproved of Roman avidity for war booty and pointed out its disadvantages, primarily that plundering people makes it harder to rule them, since they will mourn and resent the loss of their art. He advocates restraint and adherence to the laws of war, an early articulation of that concept. It is Polybius who first articulates the idea that art has a location in which it is best seen and appreciated, to which it belongs. His larger point, though, is to the rulers themselves, saying that don't plunder the people that you have just conquered, because they will resent it and will make it harder for you to rule them. Polybius' commentary on Roman behavior in war was taken up and expanded in a different context 2 generations later by Cicero. Still near the beginning of his career as a lawyer and politician, Cicero agreed to prosecute an unusual and notorious extortion case brought on by Sicilians against Gaius Verres, who served as the Roman governor of Sicily from 73 to 70 BCE. This was 2 years longer than the usual one-year term because ongoing problems with pirates and the slave uprising led by Spartacus had kept busy his potential successors in office. Verres had bragged openly that the first year's profit from his governorship was for himself, the second for his lawyers, and the third and richest year's profit was for his judges and juries. He openly was expecting to bribe them. Cicero made this case relevant and urgent to the immediate audience in the Roman Forum by focusing on Verres' theft, plundering, and looting of art. He was a maniac collector of all kinds, including cult statues held both publicly and privately. You would invite the governor over to dinner to your house, and he would take a look at your silver dishes, your gold that you had inherited from your grandfather and earlier, and he would say, "Oh, this is really nice. Do you mind if I borrow this?" And what could you say? Sure, have a look, because they often were embossed with beautiful artistic designs, and then you would never see them again. And he did this all around the island. The Sicilians were quite wealthy, and they had a long tradition of making gold and silver plate, and he simply amassed it all together. The speeches that Cicero gave provided considerable insight into how Romans viewed Greek art, how they appreciated it and what it meant to them and to its Greek owners. Cicero uses the fundamentally religious purpose behind the creation of artistic objects as the basis for his assertion that by profaning its purpose, Verres, as governor, was guilty of impiety, and because he acted on behalf of Rome, that impiety extended to the whole Roman people. These actions were taken by a Roman governor in time of peace, not of war, but in fact, Verres took even dedicated items in temples that had been left in place by the Roman general Marcellus, who had sacked Syracuse more than 100 years before, for his own private use. Cicero also argues that works of art may have a specific location, a context in which they belong, and that statuary from temples should not be used simply to grace private dinner parties. He anticipates Verres' defensive claims that items were purchased at absurdly low prices, with the firm assertion that the integrity of the local culture should not be torn apart by a superior force, either by commerce or by the authority of the Roman Empire. These arguments worked. Cicero was able to provide extraordinary detail and many, many boxes of documentation that he had gathered up by going to Sicily to back up his assertions. And he marshals an array of arguments based on ethical ideals, which he urges should be the foundation of Roman government. Verres left for permanent exile before the trial was over, presumably with his art collection in tow. He went to Marseille, which was a favorite place at that time for people who couldn't quite cut it in Rome to go and hang out. Cicero's career was now established, and he published his speeches. One interesting side effect of this case was that collecting Greek art now became rather unfashionable among the Roman elite. No one wanted to be like Verres, and conspicuous consumption shifted to fancy architecture, elaborate fish ponds for exotic species, costly new furniture, and an intense interest in hard-to-obtain food. This is really the 1st century BC. After this trial is really where we get major cookbooks and interest in Roman food, because they were shifting away from collecting antiques. The idea of repatriation of beloved statues is a theme constantly stressed by Cicero, who makes much of Scipio Aemilianus's return of Carthaginian booty in the previous 2 generations, and of the emotional attachment that communities felt to their statuary. Repatriation as a noble action emerged again not long after. Augustus specifically notes in his Res Gestae, which is an account of his accomplishments written by him and published throughout the Roman Empire in the form of inscriptions that we still have preserved today, that he repatriated statues supposedly taken by his opponent Mark Antony to cities in Asia Minor, and he lists the many temples that he, Augustus, paid for out of his war booty. The lust for looted statuary tapered off somewhat as the Roman Empire became more established. Caligula is said to have taken a lot, some of it repatriated by Claudius, and again we have preserved inscriptions that commemorate that in Athens. But then Nero took even more from Delphi and other sanctuaries in Greece. By the time of the Emperor Hadrian, it would be fair to say that Romans were in the business of dedicating and donating new statuary and buildings rather than taking the old ones away. However, by the time that Constantine was building up his new city, Constantinople, around 330, his agents were scouring the empire for choice antique pieces to decorate the new city and to make it look like a new Rome. And here you see the famous Serpent column in Istanbul today that has three intertwined snakes, and originally the heads of the snakes supported an enormous gold tripod that the Greeks had dedicated at Delphi after they defeated the Persians at Plataea in 479 BCE. Now that gold tripod was looted by Phocians in the middle of the 4th century BC, but the snake column stood at Delphi for many hundreds of years. It was seen by Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, and it was there until it was finally taken away about 330. And it still stands today in Constantinople. You can see the slide here. I gather that one of the bombs that went off last year was very, very close to it because they were bombing people in the Hippodrome. One of the terrorists had let off a suicide vest there. But from what I heard, this was still not damaged. What's so striking about it is not simply that it's an ancient image of three intertwined serpents, but on 31 coils of the snakes are inscribed the names of the cities that participated on the Greek side of the war against the Persians. So it's a very specific war trophy commemorating the end of the Persian Wars in the early 5th century BC. So it really is a major historic relic, and I'm very happy that it still exists. Polybius, Cicero, and many other Greek and Roman authors are cited by Hugo Grotius in his famous essay, Mare Liberum, 1609, in which he argues for the freedom of the seas on the basis of natural laws and natural justice. The core of this essay was a response to a case concerning a Portuguese ship laden with fabulously costly goods that was seized in the Straits of Singapore by a Dutch ship. A Mennonite member of the Dutch company that now owned the property worried about the legality of simply taking the ship. And later the event did indeed become controversial. The British were particularly stirred up by the idea that they didn't have full control over the seas. But Grotius, then in his early 20s, argues that the seizure was correct because of the circumstances, but in the course of his arguments, he established several principles that became foundational for international law, including the asserted right to trade by sea and creating distinctions between various kinds of goods and property. His essay is an enduring contribution, for Grotius argues that international law has a universal application that transcends the state, a concept he expands from some of Cicero's philosophical essays. Thus, we see that as the concept of cultural property evolves through the centuries, it grows through philosophical and ethical discussions concerning legal issues. But when applied, so far in this point of history, it is still applied by fiat. That is, at the time of the 17th century, it's by fiat rather than by judicial cases. Interest in the physical remains of antiquity increased in the 18th century when wealthy people from Northern Europe and some from North America could go on what was called the Grand Tour of Italy. Such grand tourists were well educated in the classics and wanted to see remains of ancient Roman culture. The discovery of Herculaneum and Pompeii brought even more visitors. The idea of being able to walk down an actual ancient Roman street was fabulously attractive. The grand tourists like Mr. and Mrs. Izzard of Baltimore purchased antiquities and hired artists like John Singleton Coppleton to make drawings and paintings that could be used as souvenirs in lieu of the ubiquitous selfies that we have today. Such 18th century collections eventually became the center of several museums, such as the Townley collection for the British Museum. In the early modern period, the most remarkable instances of repatriation and restitution occurred in the aftermath of Waterloo. Preceding that battle, as the French rose to power under Napoleon's expansion of his empire, art and antiquities were once again plundered on a Roman-like scale. As is well known, Napoleon ventured into Egypt and gathered up many antiquities that were then taken by the British after they defeated his navy. So that today, the Rosetta Stone, for example, is in the British Museum, and those antiquities originally gathered by the French are the core of the British Museum's collection. Apart from the annoyed French scientists who had been brought to Egypt by Napoleon specifically to gather up this material, and incidentally also establish the field of Egyptology, so there is a very positive side of this, there was relatively little outcry. That is, no one thought that Napoleon should not have taken all of this. And you can see from the inscriptions that are visible actually better on the cast today. That's why I'm showing you two sides of the cast rather than the original. You can see captured by the British, captured in Egypt by the British Army, 1801. So this was definitely regarded as a war trophy. But Napoleon went on to take altar paintings from churches, panel paintings and sculpture from private and civic collections, geological specimens, even the papal archives and the Pope's working papers in his campaigns in Western Europe, and this caused huge controversy. At the time, the Laocoon was considered the most beautiful of all ancient artwork, and that also was taken by Napoleon from the papal collections, where it had been since its rediscovery underneath the Baths of Titus in 1506. Napoleon also took the bronze horses from on top of San Marco in Venice, where they had been put since the Venetians had taken them from Constantinople in 1204. Now, we don't know exactly where the horses stood originally, and there's even debate about whether they are ancient Greek or ancient Roman, although opinion now is that they're probably 1st century BCE based on the alloy content of the bronze. But in any case, they probably graced some sort of dedication, such as one at Delphi is the most likely place where they were originally set up. And recent conservation efforts revealed that, in fact, the bronze horses were completely gilded, which had not been known at the time that Napoleon plundered them. Raphael's Transfiguration was one of many large painted altarpieces that were looted from Italian churches and moved to Paris. Among the French, many artists and writers opposed this wholesale plundering. Antoine Catemer de Concy, among them, who quoted Cicero's Verines as support for arguing that art has a natural location where it should stay. This essential point about context is still a central argument today. Looted mosaics should be returned to the churches in Cyprus where they were originally mortared on the walls. The Parthenon sculpture in the UK should be rejoined with the rest of the sculpture and the rest of the building that is in Athens. Let the British have the casts rather than the Greeks. Napoleon, however, had grand plans for a universal museum to be named after himself, which would include the best that the world had to offer as an inspiration to French artists and the French people who would best appreciate the art. And I think that this is an important point to consider in the plea for the idea of a universal museum, that is universal to whom and set up for whom, who is the audience for this universal museum. He deliberately modeled Roman attitudes about war booties by staging a triumph in which 25 wagons of sculpture and other artistic spoils were paraded and brought back into Paris on July 27th and 28th. It took 2 days, 1798. This Roman-style event was commemorated in several media, including this painted porcelain volute crater. And here you see a detail featuring the Laocoon on one side of it, with French dignitaries escorting the books and scrolls from the papal libraries through a Roman-style triumphal arch. And the commemoration took a more permanent form as the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, modeled on the Arch of Constantine in Rome, and begun in 1806 after the French victory at Austerlitz. After Waterloo, the victorious Prussians and the King of Netherlands wanted their pictures back, and the Pope sent the renowned sculptor Antonio Canova to argue that the horses of San Marco in Venice and the papal collections, including the Laocoon, should be returned to Italy. This was one of many issues, including the fate of Napoleon, whether he should be put to death, imprisoned, where he should be imprisoned, and as you know, he was eventually exiled to the island of St. Helena. After all, they had put him on Elba the year before, but he escaped from Elba. He broke his oath as a gentleman and escaped, so it was clear he was no gentleman. The Duke of Wellington had to deal with this in occupied Paris in September 1815. In consultation with the British Foreign Secretary, Robert Stewart, that is Viscount Castlereagh, and the British Prime Minister, Robert Banks Jenkinson, that is the Earl of Liverpool, the Duke decided to initiate the repatriation of as much as possible of Napoleon's artistic plunder. The basic principles the British trio hammered out were that the right of conquest does not give the right of new possession of new plunder. Hence, the British and the Prussians did not plunder France anew. They could have done that, and if they had been of the mindset of Napoleon, they would have, not only taking everything in the Louvre, but plundering all of France, which is exactly what Napoleon had done a few years prior up and down Italy. They argued that unequal treaties signed by force in wartime, such as the Treaty of Tolentino, were not legitimate because they were forced signatures in time of war. They argued that art belongs in its ancient seat. And notice that that is subject to interpretation because the horses went back to Venice, not back to Constantinople. They argued that cultural property, that is art, books, archival documents, scientific specimens, do belong in a special protected category to be treated apart from other kinds of possessions such as land and gold. For indeed, they did force France to pay reparations. So the France was subject definitely to penalty, but not in the form of art objects. At the time, these conclusions were resented deeply by the Parisian public. The Duke of Wellington needed cohorts of his army of occupation in order to keep order among the French populace when the evacuation started of the bronze horses. They were then on top of the Arc de Triomphe, but the removal of plundered paintings from the Louvre also required an army, escorted. The curators had to be escorted by the army because there were so many people at the gates saying that these paintings should not be returned to Italy. Also, we're told that women were weeping and swooning over the return of the Apollo Belvedere because he was so handsome. These are newspaper accounts that I researched that were reported in England and in France. This was repatriation by fiat. And current estimates are that only about 55% of what was taken by Napoleon was returned. For much of the art had been squirreled off to provincial cities in France where it was hard to retrieve them, and some of it was considered too fragile for further transport. But the race was on. Within Western Europe generally, and Britain, the plundering of Egypt, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Prussia had opened up the possibilities of collecting of universal museums which could be justified with nationalistic and educational aims, ideas rooted in the mid-18th century but now underway in full force. In a letter dated June 16th, 2015, the very eve of the Battle of Waterloo, Lord Elgin offered sculpture he had taken from the Parthenon for sale to the British Museum. War news and its urgent aftermath caused everything to be postponed, but a year later, the trustees grudgingly agreed to purchase the sculpture and architecture that he had taken from Athens. Meanwhile, an intense international competition was already underway in Greece, which was then still under Ottoman rule, Turkey, and the Near East for further acquisition by purchase, plunder, or unequal division after excavation, which became the norm later on in the 19th century. Thus, from the later 18th century onward, wartime plundering or appropriation of cultural property through commerce or unequal treaty by a stronger power was intertwined with the interests of museums and collectors, and in the later 19th century, even scientific excavators, often opposed to the source country's best interests. Readers will be familiar, and you will be familiar, with the Lieber Code formulated at President Abraham Lincoln's request by Francis Lieber, who as a 16-year-old had fought at Waterloo. He lied about his age in order to get into the army. He was in the Prussian army on the side of the British. He was part of the Allies, and he would have been aware of the tumult in Paris over plundered art. Lieber had emigrated to the U.S. That was actually after he had a stint in Greece, fighting on the side of the Greeks for in their war of independence against the Turks. He then went, very interesting man, he then went to the U.S. He became a distinguished professor of political science. His code, General Orders Number 100, provides rules of engagement for soldiers and instructs them about how to treat the enemy's property. The Lieber Code, in turn, was a model for subsequent international conventions on cultural property, including the important Hague Convention of 1907. And still today, American personnel in the armed forces are given small cards that they're supposed to carry even into battle, that give them instructions about how to behave on the battlefield. And ultimately, the core of it is to protect the enemy's cultural property. The history of the fate of art in the two world wars, especially the second, does not provide optimism about self-restraint or humane behavior, what Xenophon called philanthropia and attributed to Cyrus. Here you see documented some of the efforts taken by the French to prevent German plundering. Yet the very formulation of the monuments men by the Allies, even if they could not restore and protect everything, was a remarkable step forward. The first ever establishment of an official group in time of war for the protection of cultural property, even on enemy soil. This photograph was taken by the Monuments Men team, and it documents just a tiny fraction of the overwhelming job they faced. The actions taken since World War II to restore and repair do give cause for optimism, including the new legislation that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that's now before the bipartisan, fortunately, Senate Judiciary Committee that extends the time of restitution claims on a federal level rather than on an individual state level. Looting of archaeological sites and even museums in recent wartime conditions is a modern extension of the ancient issue of ownership of art. According to newspaper reports, one motive for the new German legislation that I mentioned on the sale of antiquities is to thwart the practice of ISIL, who systematically loot sites in Syria and elsewhere to sell artifacts in an effort to finance their terrorist activities. They planted mines, damaged and looted Palmyra, and used the Palmyrene Theater to film their executions of prisoners. We are in a new situation with new atrocities. Meanwhile, apart from such warfare in Syria, looting of antiquities continues around the globe because it still feeds a voracious appetite among collectors and some museums. The record among American museums is mixed but improving. Some, such as the University of Pennsylvania Museum, stopped buying antiquities in 1970 in accordance with the UNESCO agreement of that year. The Getty Museum declared its respect for the agreement in 2006. Others, such as the New York Metropolitan Museum, continue to acquire new antiquities. In the last decade, investigative journalists have exposed the criminal background of the chains of acquisition from the Tombaroli and the Clandestini in Italy and other source countries to museum curators and collectors. Nonetheless, at least one director has tried to revive claims that the encyclopedic museum's needs should override the claims of nations to retain their heritage, and that's James Cuno. What we lose from the looting that feeds contemporary collecting is unique historical context. But I wish to conclude on a positive note. Here is an example of the repatriation and rejoining of a large grave stele thanks to scholarly detective work. And this has to do with Professor George Despini's upbringing as the son of a sculptor and quarrier on the island of Tinos, which is famous for its white marble. And Professor Despini's had such an amazing memory that he was able, simply by memory, to join the upper and lower halves of this very, very large, almost life-size stele. So the lower half was found at Porta Rafti, near the site of ancient Brauron in Greece, and Despini saw a photograph of the upper left corner that you see with the heads of the deceased young man and probably his father to the left there, and he was able to join them mentally and to demonstrate that in fact they do go together. And you'll note that we're still missing one corner, and perhaps that is in somebody else's collection that we don't know about, or perhaps it is yet to be discovered. But at least there are instances where things are rejoined, and that stele is now exhibited in the Brauron Museum. For the sake of protecting archaeological sites, which are not a renewable resource, it would be best simply to end the marketing and collecting of antiquities. I think the day is over. The new German legislation purportedly will shut down the trade in antiquities in that country, which is a start. And as an archaeologist, I applaud it. Thank you.
We have time for just a few questions, if people have any questions. Mr. Mom. Well, if no one else does, I have questions.
Sure.
Is there any evidence in the record of any influence on Scipio? You know, who affected him in terms of his actions?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about what is referred to as the Scipionic circle. That is there were historians who postulated that there must have been a cultural phenomenon of these men who were in the same social status, more or less, coming together socially and discussing this, because that time in the mid-2nd century BCE was a time of great fruitful cultural production in Rome too, and there are several well-known individuals who are associated with that. The difficulty is understanding remotely from this time what Polybius's personal standing would have been with Scipio, because Polybius was actually a prisoner of war. He was from an elite family in Greece, in Achaia, but he was one of 1,000 prisoners who had been exchanged and who were actually forced to live in Rome. But he took advantage of his situation and apparently became friends with Scipio, his brother, and the family there. And so we have the sense that he was like a close personal companion. And I would say there probably was a lot of discussion and influence back and forth. One can only assume it. But there's no definite proof, in part because not the entire corpus of Polybius has been preserved, and some crucial books are still, I'm hoping maybe they'll come up in the sands of Egypt in the form of papyri. But it's really, at this point, really speculation about the degree of impact. But I think it's fair to assume that they did have discussions about this. And particularly Polybius's description of Scipio's behavior at the sack suggests that he was at his side, and so they must have talked about this. And we do know that by that time there had been the whole issue of war booty as a boiling cauldron. The problem was that the troops felt very, very much that they deserved to plunder, so that just a short time earlier in 168 BC, the troops of Aemilianus, a different Aemilianus, Aemilius Paulus, had plundered 170 towns in Epirus deliberately. And the Senate allowed them to do this because they were afraid that the army would rebel. So it wasn't only an ethical discussion, it was also a practical issue of keeping control on the troops. And this is why Scipio himself abstained from taking anything and forbade his family to even buy anything that they might have wanted from the Carthaginian loot. It wasn't that they challenged the right to loot, but what was problematic was the distribution of the loot. And we're talking about a vast sum that would be the equivalent of, let's say, billions of dollars today, if you were to try to make an equation there. But as for their actual relationship, unfortunately, we just don't have that much information. Yes?
Has the attempt to stigmatize the collection of plundered art or booty ever really gained traction culturally in any whether in antiquity or in today's world?
Well, as I mentioned, the idea of collecting antique Greek art did diminish after Cicero published his speeches. So people who had money still wanted to spend money and still have status display as is perfectly normal, but they shifted away from buying up antiques. And even Cicero himself, who owned many houses, as most members of the Senate would, had new art created that he ordered from Greece, and we have a record of that in his correspondence. So there I would say that the appetite for collecting antiquities diminished a little bit and shifted to other areas. But I would say that the appetite, more or less, is still there and is still strong.
That just lasts for a brief period of time, like 100 years in Roman society, then decided.
Well, Roman society began to really produce its own stuff, and that seems to have been, rather than making emulations of Greek art, starting in the time of Augustus, actually, Roman art shifted to not so much imitating what the Greeks had done or building on that, but creating really a whole new style. And so what was fueling art production was on the one hand, patronage from emperors and the well-to-do, because by that time the Principate was in place, but also there was a sense it was one of those periods when there was great creativity. So new things were produced rather than so much collecting old things. And so in art history, generally, you see periods that are more retrospective and periods that are moving forward. What happened after the trial of Verres is that Roman art in general was moving forward on its own speed rather than being retrospective and collecting. Today, I would say it just depends on what your nationality is, who you are, what your social circle is, but certainly I would think that with all of the attention in even best-selling books to the stain of looting, that this would diminish the appetite. But I'm not sure that it really does. Some people really love it. Yes, Jennifer.
What's diminished the appetite is that collectors can no longer give these objects to our museums and get big tax deductions, because the museums, in theory, can't take them now if they don't have a provenance. So that incentive is gone. But I have another question. Even earlier, the Romans actually took the Etruscan gods from their temples and moved them to Rome, and not because it was necessarily art looting, but they wanted the power of those divinities in their own city. So that was, the motive was rather different back then. And in some cases later, we think that they actually, say in Greece, that the Hermes at Olympia is a good example, that if that's not original, they took the original and they somebody produced a very good copy to replace it. The Eros of Thespiae is another example, you know. So they did, I mean, there was, I'm just putting some nuance into this, you know, as to just,
yes,
you know,
certainly.
taking it for personal gain.
That's quite true. Livy gives us a wonderful description of how after the fall of Veii in the 390s, so this is back in the early 4th century BCE, the young men of the Roman army who were chosen to do this took a special bath, put on special white clothes, and they went into the temple of Juno at Veii, and they prayed to the goddess, inviting her to come with them. And there is a Latin term, evocatio, to try to summon the goddess and bring her. And Livy claims that as the young men picked up the trestle that supported the statue of Juno, that it was incredibly light. And they thought that that would signify the fact that the goddess was being willing to move from Veii to actually probably the Aventine in Rome. So there was that ceremony of evocatio that was used in the Roman Republic, but it probably was not used much after that. Yes.
Hi, I'm struck by the similarity between Napoleon's proposed Universal Museum and the proposed museum at Linz, Austria, that Hitler would have built. And so my question is whether conquering and plundering was justified by those persons based on preserving the world's cultural property in a single place for all to come and appreciate there.
We don't read of anything in Napoleon's accounts about that particular idea. Rather, what Napoleon was trying to do, and I think Hitler was emulating him, as far as I understand it, was to create a collection that would inspire the French. In other words, the motive is to bring all of the world's best art into one place to inspire French artists. And in fact, it did to some extent have that, and not only French, but some British artists who came down. And it has, after all, think of the Impressionist movement and so on that eventually came from that. So it was supposed to inspire French artists in particular, but also it had to be in a place where had finally a worthy audience. And I think that that second part is important to remember, because that's also what Hitler was emulating. That there is a particular group of people who are better educated, more elite, more sophisticated, and they can appreciate this art more than the people back there who actually had it originally. So there's a very elitist in the worst sense of the word, to put it mildly, idea here that some people are more deserving than others to have this great art to look at. And I think that that's one of the most reprehensible aspects of all of this. You might feel a little bit sympathetic about the idea of artistic inspiration, but the second part, the idea that some people are more worthy than others to be looking at this art is really quite despicable in my opinion. But I do also think that Hitler was emulating Napoleon. I think that that's a very common idea out there. Yeah. Yes?
I have a collecting history question. So, you had mentioned, for example, the Duke of Wellington, and the Duke of Wellington, thank you, was citing Cicero and was arguing for the return of cultural property. But of course, when you visit Apsley House, the first thing you see when you walk in the door is the giant Canova of Napoleon. So it's sort of, it's as though the Duke of Wellington is kind of exercising the war booty demons by kind of turning towards the contemporary. So I just wondered, is there any kind of historical trend of kind of advocating for the return of cultural property? Does that sort of drive a turn towards the contemporary?
I think it's certainly in Wellington's case, it does, because the Canova was given to him as a gift. And he did purchase a few antiquities. In 1816, there's a bust of Cicero that he bought in Paris. But I would say I really looked into this issue quite a bit because I wanted to see whether there was even a shred of hypocrisy here. And there isn't, actually, there isn't. On the contrary, we have preserved correspondence that he and his brother Henry Wellesley wrote. First of all, the huge plunder that they got was after the Battle of Vittoria. And what happened there is that Joseph Bonaparte had gathered up all the booty from Madrid, and he was trying to flee back to France with it. So the French had plundered Spain thoroughly, had gathered up all of this booty, including rolled up paintings in tubes, and the battle at Vittoria was such an overwhelming victory that the French barely escaped, and they left behind just millions of dollars of worth of gold, because that was supposed to be the pay chest for the French army. All of these rolled up paintings from what had been the Madrid Royal Collection, 100 carriages, the courtesans of all of the royalty, their children and their pets, including parrots and dogs and everything else. So the British had to deal with all of this leftover booty. What they did with the artwork was to send it back. They didn't know what it was. They didn't have time to look at it. They just sent it all back to England. So what the Wellesley brothers did was to have it inspected a couple of years later. Then they recognized this is the Madrid Royal Collection, and they begged to give it back to Ferdinand VII, who by that time had been reinstalled as King of Spain. We have preserved the correspondence of that king saying, no, please keep it. And that's why you have that incredible collection of painting in Apsley House. But yes, I think your question is really well taken, that it's better to create new art than to collect this older art that's tainted, and that in general seems to be yet another turning point. By the way, the Duke also was interested in antiquity a little bit, and he, in Stratford-Sae, decorated one of his guest rooms with prints of Pompeii. And this is another interesting aspect of making antiquities and ancient art accessible, is through prints and then, of course, photography. I think you had a question too, didn't you?
I do, but I will pick up with you afterwards.
Okay, sure.
That finishes our time for this morning session, and I want to thank Professor Myles for her contribution.
Thank you.
And we have a 10-minute break before we begin the first panel at 10:15. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was extraordinarily